I was the only safety engineer on a $400 million oil rig, but when a Category 4 hurricane hit, the rig boss fired me, claiming women didn't belong offshore. He threw me on the last chopper out, thinking I'd stay quiet. But he didn't realize I took the encrypted safety drives with me, and I was about to trigger an evacuation that would cost him everything. At 6:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, the air out on the deepwater platform already tasted like metallic rain and diesel exhaust. The sky above the Gulf was a bruised, purple-gray canvas, signaling the beast that was churning its way toward us. Hurricane Cassandra was a Category 4 monster, and it was slated to hit our coordinates in less than 48 hours. As the lead safety engineer on the Oceanic Vanguard, a $400 million floating fortress, my job was to ensure the 200 souls on board didn't end up at the bottom of the sea. I stood on the lower deck, my steel-toed boots gripping the grated metal walkway, holding my digital clipboard. The wind was already howling, whipping my fire-retardant coveralls against my legs. I was staring at the pressure gauges on the secondary drill line. The numbers were flashing a steady, angry amber. They were running the drill too fast, too deep, ignoring the foundational stress limits. "Scott, are you just going to stare at that screen all day, or are you going to do something productive?" I didn't need to turn around to recognize that voice. Miles Green. He was the offshore installation manager, the man who treated this rig like his personal, untouchable kingdom. I turned slowly. Miles was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored safety jacket that looked like it had never seen a drop of crude oil, a stark contrast to my grease-stained uniform. He had the kind of arrogant smirk that was bought with a trust fund and polished in corporate boardrooms. "The pressure on Line B is exceeding safety parameters by 15%, Miles," I stated clearly, raising my voice over the roar of the ocean and the mechanical groan of the rig. "With the storm coming, we need to shut down the main drill and begin securing the blowout preventers. The structural integrity of the lower risers is compromised." Miles laughed. It wasn't a friendly sound. It was sharp and entirely dismissive. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, the scent of expensive cologne clashing horribly with the smell of the sea. "We are not shutting down," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Every hour we stop drilling costs this company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Luca Campbell expects results, not excuses from a safety inspector who gets nervous when the wind blows." "This isn't just wind," I fired back, standing my ground. "It's a Category 4. Protocol dictates a mandatory scale-down. If we don't bleed the pressure now, a sudden surge during the storm could cause a catastrophic blowout. I am officially logging a critical safety violation." Miles's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You log whatever you want, sweetheart, but I make the calls out here. This is a man's game. When the pressure gets too high, you people always panic. Go back to your desk and play with your little spreadsheets. I'll handle the heavy lifting." He turned on his heel and walked away, his boots echoing hollowly on the metal grate. I stood there, the wind biting at my cheeks, my knuckles white from gripping the clipboard. It wasn't just his blatant misogyny that made my blood run cold, it was the sheer recklessness in his eyes. He was hiding something. The drill speed wasn't just aggressive, it was desperate. I walked back to the control room, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind me, sealing out the storm's roar. Jackson "Jax" Adams, the lead driller, was staring at the monitors with a tight jaw. He looked at me, his eyes betraying his fear. Jax had a family back home and a pension he was terrified of losing. "He won't stop, Mia," Jax muttered, glancing nervously at the door. "He's pushing the rig past the red line." "I know," I replied, pulling up the master schematic on my terminal. "And I'm going to find out exactly why." I began to download the encrypted telemetry data. The storm was gathering outside, but the real disaster was already brewing right here on the rig. By 11:30 p.m. on Wednesday night, Hurricane Cassandra had fully swallowed the Oceanic Vanguard. The ocean was no longer water. It was a furious, churning wall of black glass smashing against the rig's massive steel pylons. The entire structure, weighing tens of thousands of tons, groaned and shuddered with every impact. Emergency lights bathed the interior corridors in an eerie, pulsing red glow. I was tucked away in the auxiliary server room, a cramped, freezing space vibrating with the hum of cooling fans and the relentless pounding of the storm outside. I had bypassed the standard firewall and was deep into the rig's primary diagnostic mainframe. What I found made my stomach drop. Miles wasn't just ignoring the pressure. He had authorized deep-water fracking techniques that were strictly illegal in this sector. The foundational rock was fracturing. The rig was literally tearing itself apart from the ocean floor up. The progress bar on my encrypted USB drive hit 98%. Just 2 more percent, and I would have the undeniable proof I needed to shut Miles down and save the crew. Suddenly, the heavy metal door to the server room slammed open. Miles Green stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 burly rig security contractors. The red emergency light cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look almost unhinged. "Step away from the console, Scott," Miles barked, his voice echoing sharply in the small room. I quickly yanked the tiny USB drive from the port, palming it seamlessly into the deep pocket of my coveralls before turning around. I was running a secondary diagnostic, Miles. The lower risers are showing microfractures. We need to initiate the emergency disconnect sequence now, or the blowout preventers will fail. Miles marched toward me, his eyes completely devoid of reason. "You are done here," he said, his tone like ice. "You're fired, effective immediately." I stared at him, the deck swaying violently beneath our feet. You can't fire the only safety engineer in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane. That's a direct violation of maritime law and corporate safety protocols. "Watch me," he sneered, gesturing to the guards. "I told Luca Campbell you were a liability. I told him women don't belong offshore, especially when things get tough. You panic. You slow us down. You are a threat to this operation." "I'm a threat to your illegal drilling," I shouted, the noise of the storm nearly drowning me out. "I know what you're doing down there, Miles." For a fraction of a second, panic flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating fury. "Escort her to her quarters," he ordered the guards. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a single bag. The last supply chopper is leaving in 15 minutes before the wind shear makes it impossible to fly. You are getting on it." The 2 guards stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. I knew fighting them physically was useless. I had the data. That was what mattered. "You are going to kill everyone on this rig," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. Miles just smirked. "Get her off my rig." They marched me down the narrow, violently rocking corridors. Everything was chaos. Crew members were rushing past, securing loose equipment, their faces pale with fear. When we reached my small cabin, I shoved my clothes, my laptop, and most importantly, the USB drive securely hidden inside a rolled-up pair of socks, into my duffel bag. My mind was racing. He wasn't just firing me out of misogyny, he was blinding the rig's safety oversight. With me gone, he could manipulate the sensors and continue drilling, risking a catastrophic blowout to hit his corporate quotas. He thought kicking me off the rig would silence me. He had no idea I was walking away with the very blueprint of his destruction in my pocket. At 12:15 a.m., the helipad was a scene from a nightmare. The rain wasn't falling, it was flying horizontally, hitting my face like tiny, frozen needles. The wind roared so loudly it vibrated in my teeth. The Sikorsky S-92 helicopter sat on the deck, its rotors spinning furiously, struggling to remain grounded against the hurricane's immense power. The 2 security guards practically shoved me toward the open door. I scrambled inside, throwing my duffel bag onto the floor and buckling myself into the heavy, 4-point harness. There were 3 other people in the cabin, non-essential personnel being evacuated at the last possible second. They looked terrified, clutching their armrests, their knuckles white. I didn't feel fear. I felt an icy, crystalline focus. The pilot gave a thumbs up, and the chopper lifted off. Instantly, we were thrown violently to the left by a massive wind shear. My stomach dropped as the helicopter plummeted several feet before the engines screamed, fighting for altitude. We banked sharply, and through the rain-streaked window, I looked back at the oceanic vanguard. It looked like a fragile metal toy in the middle of a furious, black cauldron. The giant waves smashed against its legs, sending plumes of white spray hundreds of feet into the air. Somewhere in the heart of that structure, Miles Green was bypassing the safety protocols, pushing the drill deeper into fractured rock, blinded by his own arrogance and corporate greed. He had jeopardized 200 lives just to protect his own ego and his profit margins. The flight was an hour of pure turbulence. We bounced and dropped through the sky, the cabin dark except for the occasional flash of lightning. I held my duffel bag tightly on my lap, my hand resting over the spot where the USB drive was hidden. That drive was a loaded gun, and I was going to make sure Miles was standing right in front of the barrel when it went off. As we finally broke through the worst of the storm bands and approached the coastal mainland, the cell service indicator on my phone blinked to life. I had bars. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline. I immediately opened my messages. I couldn't contact Jax directly on the rig's network. Miles would be monitoring the comms. Instead, I sent a highly encrypted, prearranged code word to a secure relay that Jax checked periodically. "Hold the line, help is coming." Next, I typed a message to my daughter, Willow. She was in her final year of environmental law school, sharp as a tack and fiercely loyal. "Mom, emergency evac. I'm safe. Miles fired me to cover up illegal deepwater fractures. I have the data. Need you to start pulling all public environmental filings for the energy conglomerate and Luca Campbell. Meet me at the house." Her reply came back in less than a minute. "Willow, oh my God, Mom, on it. See you in 2 hours." I leaned my head back against the vibrating wall of the helicopter. Miles thought he had won. He thought that by throwing me into a hurricane and playing the weak woman card, he could discredit me and continue his reckless operation. He underestimated me. I needed someone who could crack the deepest layers of the rig's encrypted files, someone who knew how to navigate the murky waters of maritime law and corporate espionage. I needed someone who owed me a debt they could never repay. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't called in 10 years. David McIntyre. It was time to call in the life debt. The moment this chopper touched down, the real storm was going to begin for Miles Green. At 2:45 a.m. on Thursday, the Sikorsky S-92 helicopter's wheels slammed hard onto the rain-slicked concrete of the mainland heliport. The outer bands of Hurricane Cassandra were already lashing the coastline, but the immediate, crushing danger of the open ocean was finally behind me. I didn't wait for the massive rotors to fully power down before unbuckling my heavy 4-point harness and grabbing my canvas duffel bag. The fluorescent lights of the small, desolate terminal flickered ominously as I pushed through the heavy double glass doors. The immediate smell of damp concrete and stale vending machine coffee hit my senses, a stark contrast to the diesel and salt spray of the rig. I bypassed the small cluster of exhausted, evacuated workers and found a secluded corner near an abandoned ticket counter. I dropped my bag onto the scuffed linoleum floor and pulled out my ruggedized field laptop. The Oceanic Vanguard was currently a sitting duck in a Category 4 hurricane, with an arrogant, reckless manager driving a structurally compromised drill straight into the fragile seabed. Miles Green truly believed that physically removing me from the platform removed the only obstacle to his illegal operation. He was dead wrong. Before he had his security contractors march me out of the auxiliary server room, I hadn't just downloaded the encrypted telemetry data and the structural stress logs. I had also quietly activated a dormant, ghost protocol in the rig's central safety mainframe. It was a dead man's switch, a heavily restricted failsafe designed specifically for a catastrophic system failure where the command structure was compromised. My cold fingers flew across the rigid plastic keys of my laptop. The heliport's spotty, unsecured Wi-Fi was barely holding on against the storm, but it was just enough to ping the heavily encrypted satellite relay I had established months ago. The screen glowed brightly with lines of scrolling green code, illuminating my face in the otherwise dim terminal. I typed in my master safety engineer credentials. The system paused, then prompted me for the 6-digit override authorization code. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I punched in the numbers. Instantly, a silent, irreversible command shot through the satellite uplink directly into the Oceanic Vanguard's digital nervous system. Back out in the churning, pitch-black Gulf of Mexico, the rig's automated safety systems would be forcibly overriding Miles Green's manual drilling controls. The massive, multi-ton blowout preventers would violently slam shut, sealing the wellhead under immense hydraulic pressure. The primary drill would immediately disengage, plunging the entire $400 million platform into a mandatory, unoverridable lockdown state. Most importantly, the general alarm, a deafening, piercing klaxon, would now be echoing relentlessly through every deck, corridor, and cabin. It was the absolute, non-negotiable evacuation signal. By strict maritime law, once that specific automated alarm is triggered during a severe weather, our event, the offshore installation manager, completely loses all authority to countermand the order. The bright orange lifeboats would be deploying. The Coast Guard Command Center would automatically be notified. 200 crew members, including Jax Adams, would be piling into the reinforced fiberglass escape pods, dropping into the raging sea to be safely recovered. I sat back against the cold, painted cinderblock wall of the terminal and watched the confirmation dialog box pop up on my screen. Evacuation protocol initiated. Well secured. Personnel redirected. My cell phone immediately vibrated violently in my pocket. It was an incoming call from a scrambled satellite number. It had to be Miles Green. He was undoubtedly losing his mind. The automated evacuation I had just triggered was going to cost Luca Campbell and the entire energy conglomerate millions of dollars in lost production, emergency response deployment, and rig downtime. I let the phone ring, the sound vibrating against my leg. He was screaming into a void now. The crew was safe. The fragile deepwater well was securely capped. I packed my laptop back into the duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked out into the driving coastal rain to find a rental car. The storm overhead was nothing compared to the corporate hurricane I was about to unleash. At 4:15 a.m., I finally pulled my rented sedan into the driveway of my suburban home. The coastal wind was tearing leaves from the oak trees in my front yard, slapping them violently against the wet windshield. I grabbed my duffel bag and dashed to the front porch, unlocking the heavy oak door. The moment I stepped inside, the warm, dry air and the familiar scent of brewing jasmine tea grounded me. The house was quiet, except for the frantic tapping of a keyboard coming from the dining room. Willow was awake. My 24-year-old daughter sat at the large mahogany dining table, completely surrounded by towering stacks of legal pads, yellow highlighters, and open law textbooks. Her laptop screen displayed a massive spreadsheet mapping out corporate subsidiaries. When she heard the door click shut, she jumped up, practically knocking over her mug, and ran to wrap her arms around me. "Mom, you're freezing," Willow said, pulling back to inspect my damp, wrinkled coveralls. "I've been tracking the storm. The Coast Guard just issued a press release about the Oceanic Vanguard, a full emergency evacuation. Was that you?" "It was," I nodded, dropping my heavy bag onto a nearby chair. Miles Green was pushing the drill into a fractured seabed. He fired me and threw me on a chopper to blind the safety monitors. I triggered the failsafe remotely. The crew is safe, but Miles and Luca Campbell are going to come after me with an army of corporate lawyers. They will try to bury me. I reached into the deep pocket of my coveralls, retrieving the rolled-up pair of socks. I carefully pulled out the small, metallic USB drive and placed it on the table. It looked harmless, but it held enough explosive data to bankrupt a multi-billion-dollar energy empire. I have the proof right here, I explained. The telemetry logs and the illegal deepwater fracking signatures. But there is a massive problem. The moment I pulled this from the mainframe, the proprietary corporate security software locked it down. It's shielded behind military-grade AES-256 encryption. If we enter the wrong password 3 times, the drive will automatically wipe itself clean. Willow frowned. I can pull public environmental filings all day, Mom, but I don't know the first thing about cracking military-grade encryption. Who do we even call? The authorities. No, I replied instantly. Luca Campbell has regulators in his pocket. If we hand this over now, the drive will conveniently disappear into an evidence locker, and I will be painted as a disgruntled, hysterical former employee. We need someone entirely off the grid. Someone who knows marine forensics inside and out. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a number I had committed to memory a decade ago. It rang 4 times before a gruff, sleep-heavy voice answered. This better be an emergency, David. Mac Entire growled into the receiver. Mac, it's Mia Scott, I said evenly. 10 years ago, when Mac was a Coast Guard investigator, a shipping conglomerate tried to frame him for a botched inspection. I was the independent auditor who found the buried maintenance logs that cleared his name and saved his pension. Mia, Mac said, his voice instantly sharp. I just saw the news about your rig. They're saying the safety systems malfunctioned. They didn't malfunction, Mac. I triggered them to stop a catastrophe, I replied. I have a locked drive with the evidence. I need your skills. There was a brief pause. Then Mac let out a low sigh. You saved my life 10 years ago, Mia. Tell me where you are. I'm bringing my gear. I gave him the address, hung up the phone, and looked at Willow. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a fierce, calculating determination. The storm outside was beginning to peak, rattling the window panes with terrifying force, but inside this house, we were building a fortress. Miles Green thought he could discard me like broken machinery. He was about to learn that safety engineers know exactly where all the weakest structural pressure points are hidden. By 6:30 a.m., the furious howling of Hurricane Cassandra had downgraded to a steady, rhythmic drumming of heavy rain against the roof. The living room, however, had been entirely transformed into a makeshift cyberforensics laboratory. David McIntyre had arrived 30 minutes prior, hauling 3 heavy Pelican cases out of the trunk of his battered truck. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a closely cropped gray beard and piercing, analytical eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He hadn't asked for unnecessary details or offered empty platitudes. He just nodded at me, took a sip of the black coffee Willow handed him, and immediately began unpacking his hardware. Within minutes, my coffee table was covered in tangled black cables, external cooling fans, and a thick, ruggedized military laptop that looked like it could survive a bomb blast. Mac carefully inserted my silver USB drive into a specialized, isolated port on his machine. The screen instantly flashed a harsh, warning red. You weren't kidding, Mia, Mac muttered, his thick fingers dancing rapidly across his mechanical keyboard. This isn't standard corporate security. This is custom architecture. They've got a localized kill switch embedded in the firmware. 2 incorrect password attempts, and it forcefully scrambles the solid-state memory blocks. We only have 2 shots before this drive turns into an expensive metal paperweight. I stood behind him, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching the lines of code cascade down his screen like a digital waterfall. Willow stood beside me, nervously chewing on the cap of her yellow highlighter. The stakes were monumental. If we lost this data, it would just be my word against the combined legal and public relations might of Luca Campbell's multi-billion-dollar energy empire. I would be crushed, and Miles Green would walk away clean. Can you bypass the kill switch? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady despite the anxiety twisting in my gut. I'm not going to bypass it. I'm going to freeze it, Mac replied, not taking his eyes off the monitor. He connected a small, secondary device to his laptop. I'm running a brute force decryption algorithm, but I'm throttling the processing speed to trick the drive's internal clock. If I can inject a false timestamp protocol, the drive will think it's stuck in a continuous verification loop. It buys us a small window to extract the raw data packets before the firewall realizes it's been breached. For the next 45 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the aggressive whirring of Mac's laptop cooling fans and the relentless patter of the rain outside. The tension was thick enough to choke on. A progress bar slowly crawled across the center of his screen, decryption at 40%, 68%, 89%. Suddenly, the laptop emitted a sharp, high-pitched beep. The red warning screen vanished, instantly replaced by a cascade of neatly organized, unencrypted digital folders. "We're in," Mac exhaled sharply, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "The firewall is frozen. Extracting the core files to my local hard drive now." Willow pulled up a chair and leaned in close. I placed my hands on the edge of the table, my eyes scanning the document titles as Mac opened the master directory. There they were, the unedited telemetry logs, the suppressed structural integrity reports, the geological pressure warnings that I had submitted weeks ago, all marked with red IGNORED tags. But the most damning piece of evidence was hidden in a subfolder labeled Deepwater Expansion. Mac clicked it open, revealing an internal corporate memo. "Look at this," Willow gasped, pointing at the bottom of the digital document. It was a direct authorization order commanding Miles Green to utilize extreme, unapproved hydraulic fracturing methods to maximize oil extraction from the unstable seabed. It explicitly acknowledged the severe risk of foundational collapse, but deemed the financial payoff acceptable. And sitting right at the bottom of that illegal, reckless directive was the unmistakable digital signature of the CEO himself, Luca Campbell. The conspiracy didn't just end with a misogynistic rig boss. The rot went all the way to the very top of the corporate ladder. I finally had the smoking gun, and it was fully loaded. By 8:15 a.m. on Thursday, the outer bands of Hurricane Cassandra had fully moved inland, leaving behind a gray, weeping sky and the fractured remains of coastal tree branches scattered across my front lawn. Inside my Ooze, however, a completely different kind of storm was actively being manufactured. I stood in the kitchen, nursing a ceramic mug of black coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the muted television screen. The global news networks were running continuous, looping footage of the Oceanic Vanguard evacuation. The corporate spin machine was already working at maximum capacity. A sleek, perfectly poised woman appeared on the screen, standing behind a polished mahogany podium. It was Quinn Baker, the corporate HR director for Luca Campbell's energy conglomerate. She was a master of deflecting blame and constructing airtight public relations narratives. A bold news ticker scrolled beneath her face: energy conglomerate praises, heroic, safety drill during hurricane evacuation. I turned up the volume just in time to hear her smooth, practiced voice. The automated evacuation of the Oceanic Vanguard was not a system failure. Quinn lied flawlessly to the assembly of reporters. It was a highly sensitive, precautionary safety measure triggered by an anomalous sensor reading during the severe weather event. All 200 crew members were securely evacuated without a single injury. We are currently investigating the conduct of a former, disgruntled safety contractor who may have violated standard operational protocols, but the rig itself remains fundamentally secure. "They are already building the narrative to bury you, Mom," Willow said, walking into the kitchen and handing me my vibrating cell phone. "And they are working fast." I looked at the caller ID. It was a blocked number, but the voicemail notification was blinking a steady, angry red. I pressed play and put it on speaker so Willow and Mac could hear. Quinn Baker's voice filled the room, but this time, the polished public relations sheen was entirely gone. Her tone was sharp, cold, and dripping with thinly veiled corporate venom. "Mia, this is Quinn Baker. We know exactly what you did with the failsafe terminal before you boarded that helicopter," the voicemail hissed. "You have caused an unapproved, catastrophic operational halt. Our legal department is currently drafting civil and criminal charges against you for industrial sabotage, corporate espionage, and reckless endangerment. If you attempt to leak any of the proprietary data you stole, we will ensure you spend the rest of your natural life buried under federal litigation. You will never work in this industry, or any industry, ever again. Return the drive to our Houston office by noon tomorrow, and Mr. Campbell might show you some leniency." The message clicked off, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in the kitchen. They were terrified. The aggressive threat was a clear indicator that they knew exactly how exposed they were. "They don't know we've already cracked the encryption," Mac noted, his fingers never stopping their rapid, staccato rhythm on his heavy military laptop. "They think you are just sitting here, panicked, holding a locked drive you can't access." "We need an inside witness to corroborate the digital data," I said, setting my coffee mug down on the granite counter with a firm clink. I pulled up the encrypted satellite relay on my field laptop. I typed a brief message to Jackson "Jax" Adams, praying he had safely reached the onshore holding facility. "Mia, are you safe? They are blaming the evacuation on me. I have the CEO's signature on the illegal drill orders." 3 agonizing minutes passed before the secure relay pinged with a reply. "Jax, we are at the staging center in Galveston. Miles Green is pacing the floor, telling the executives you had a total mental breakdown and panicked. I won't let them do this to you, Mia. I saved the physical drill pressure logs in my waterproof go bag before I got in the lifeboat. The numbers match your reports. Tell me what to do." A tight, resolute smile crossed my face. We didn't just have the digital blueprint of their corruption. We now had the physical, handwritten logs from the lead driller himself. "Mac Willow," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Package the telemetry data, the CEO's memo, and Jax's statement. It is time to bypass the HR department entirely." At 1:45 p.m., the atmosphere in my makeshift living room command center was electric with anticipation. My coffee table was a tangled web of Ethernet cables, secondary monitors, and external hard drives. Mac had spent the last 3 hours methodically mapping the digital architecture of the energy conglomerate's internal communications network. We weren't going to hand the evidence over to a compromised regulatory agency, and we certainly weren't going to politely reply to Quinn Baker's extortion attempt. We were going to strike them where it hurt the most: their investors. "Luca Campbell is hosting an emergency, high-level virtual shareholder briefing at exactly 2:00 p.m., Willow announced, her eyes glued to her laptop screen. "He invited 300 of the company. Top-tier institutional investors to reassure them that the Oceanic Vanguard is perfectly fine and that the stock price shouldn't dip. He is trying to stop a massive financial bleed before the markets close." "Perfect," Mac grunted. His eyes narrowed as he typed a rapid sequence of commands into his terminal. "Their public-facing PR servers are fortified, but they are routing the secure video conference through a secondary, legacy server cluster in their Houston office. It's a backdoor I used to exploit during Coast Guard Marine cyber audits. I can tunnel into the primary presentation feed. Once I breach the host protocol, I can lock them out of their own broadcast for approximately 4 minutes before their IT department can physically sever the server connection." 4 minutes is a lifetime," I said, leaning over Mac's shoulder and watching the virtual waiting room populate with high-profile names and investment firm logos. "Cue up the deepwater fracking authorization memo and the foundational stress logs. Put the CEO's signature front and center." At precisely 2:00 p.m., the screen shifted. The pristine, high-definition video feed revealed Luca Campbell sitting at the head of a massive, polished oak boardroom table. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. Miles Green sat nervously to his right, looking pale and thoroughly out of his element in the corporate headquarters. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," Luca began, his voice exuding a practiced, wealthy confidence. "I want to personally assure all of our valued partners that the minor operational pause on the Oceanic Vanguard was merely a testament to our rigorous, industry-leading safety standards. A rogue contractor caused a temporary glitch, but our deepwater expansion project is entirely on schedule and completely secure." "Hit it, Mac," I commanded. Mac slammed his thumb onto the enter key. Instantly, the high-definition video feed of Luca Campbell shattered into a burst of digital static. The audio of his confident speech was abruptly cut off, replaced by a sharp, piercing electronic tone that demanded immediate attention. Across the screens of 300 billionaire investors, the corporate logo vanished. In its place, a stark, high-contrast document appeared. It was the classified engineering report detailing the microfractures in the seabed. Overlaid across the document in bright, undeniable crimson letters was the word IGNORED. I pulled my microphone headset close to my mouth and spoke clearly, my voice broadcasting directly into the pristine boardrooms and home offices of the financial elite. "This is Mia Scott, the former lead safety engineer of the Oceanic Vanguard," my voice echoed through the hijacked feed, steady and unforgiving. "You are currently being lied to by Luca Campbell and Miles Green. The platform did not experience a safety glitch. It is actively suffering from catastrophic structural failure due to illegal, unapproved deepwater hydraulic fracturing." On the corner of the screen, a small window still showed the boardroom camera. Luca Campbell's face had drained of all color. He was shouting silently at his IT directors off-screen, his composed facade entirely shattered. Miles Green looked like he was going to be physically sick. "I initiated the emergency evacuation to save 200 lives because management refused to stop drilling," I continued, as Max switched the visual to the damning internal memo. "What you are looking at now is the direct, internal authorization to bypass federal safety regulations, knowingly risking a deadly blowout to hit quarterly quotas. And right at the bottom, you will see the digital signature of your CEO, Luca Campbell." I let the document sit on their screens for 10 agonizing seconds, ensuring every single investor had time to read the authorization and see the signature. The financial liability was undeniable. The criminal negligence was now public record. The structural integrity data and the physical drill logs have just been simultaneously forwarded to the Department of Justice, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the global press, I concluded. The Oceanic Vanguard is a sinking liability, and so is this leadership team. The screen abruptly went black as their IT department finally managed to yank the physical power cords from their servers, but the digital strike was already complete. The silence in my living room was deafening. We had just dropped a bomb on a multi-billion-dollar empire, and there was no going back. By 3:30 p.m., the financial fallout was catastrophic and instantaneous. Willow had 2 different financial news networks streaming on separate monitors, and the chyrons flashing across the bottom of the screens were a blur of panic. The energy conglomerate's stock price was absolutely plummeting, nosediving by 22% in less than an hour. Trading had been temporarily halted due to extreme volatility. The digital package we forwarded to the press was already headlining major investigative journalism portals. I sat back on the sofa, feeling a strange mix of profound exhaustion and cold, hard victory. Miles Green had tried to silence me by throwing me into a hurricane, assuming my voice held no weight. He failed to understand that a safety engineer's entire job is built on documenting the truth, no matter how deeply the company tries to bury it. Suddenly, a harsh, unfamiliar ringtone pierced the quiet hum of the computer fans. It wasn't my personal cell phone. It was a cheap, plastic prepaid burner phone that Mac had purchased specifically for untraceable outgoing communications. It sat on the coffee table, vibrating violently against the wood. Mac looked at me, his eyebrows raised. I routed the IP address of our hijacked broadcast through a dummy server, leaving this specific phone number buried in the metadata as a breadcrumb. I wanted to see if they were desperate enough to reach out directly. I picked up the small plastic phone and pressed the green answer button. "This is Mia," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You have no idea what you have just done, Ms. Scott," the voice on the other end hissed. It was Luca Campbell. The smooth, polished boardroom charm was completely gone, replaced by the ragged, breathless panic of a cornered predator. He wasn't relying on his HR director to do his dirty work anymore. "I know exactly what I did, Luca," I replied calmly, gesturing for Mac to initiate the recording software. "I exposed a criminal conspiracy that compromised a $400 million asset and risked 200 innocent lives. I did my job." "You destroyed a decade of corporate growth in 4 minutes," Luca shouted, his voice cracking slightly. I could hear the frantic shuffling of papers and hushed, panicked voices in the background. "But we can fix this. The press has the documents, but they don't have verified authentication yet. They need you to testify to make it stick." "I have every intention of testifying," I stated flatly. $5 million, Luca countered immediately, the sheer desperation making him reckless. "I will wire $5 million into an offshore account of your choosing by the end of the business day. In exchange, you release a public statement claiming your system was hacked, that the documents were deepfaked by a rival corporation, and that you acted under extreme duress during the storm. You walk away rich, and your daughter, Willow, doesn't suddenly find her future legal career completely blacklisted by every major law firm in the country." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Bringing my daughter into his threats was the absolute final nail in his coffin. Willow looked at me from across the room, her expression fierce and unyielding. She gave me a single, firm nod. "You think this is about money, Luca?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you can buy your way out of a fractured seabed and a rigged safety system? You authorized an illegal deepwater operation, and Miles Green enforced it. You treated my crew like expendable line items on a spreadsheet." "Take the money, Mia," Luca pleaded, the threat giving way to begging. "If you don't, I swear to God, I have enough lawyers to tie you up in court until you are entirely bankrupt. You will lose this house. You will lose everything." "Keep your money, Luca," I replied, staring at the blinking red recording light on Mac's computer. "And you should save your lawyers for the federal regulators, because I'm not just giving them the data. I'm giving them the audio recording of the CEO offering a $5 million bribe to a federal witness." I didn't wait for his response. I ended the call and tossed the plastic phone onto the table. "Did you get it all, Mac?" I asked. "Crystal clear," Mac grinned, saving the audio file with a heavy keystroke. "Extortion, bribery, and witness tampering. He just handed us the rope to hang him with." The trap was fully set, and the leaders of the energy empire had just walked willingly into the steel jaws. The storm outside was finally breaking, but for Luca Campbell and Miles Green, the real devastation was only just beginning. At 9:00 a.m. on Friday, the heavy, oppressive gray clouds finally broke, allowing pale shafts of morning sunlight to illuminate my cluttered living room. But the storm I had unleashed was just making landfall in Houston. My television was tuned to a major news network, and the aerial helicopter footage showed a fleet of black, unmarked government SUVs swarming the gleaming glass plaza of Luca Campbell's corporate headquarters. The FBI, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Justice had formed a joint task force. They were not knocking politely. They were executing federal search warrants with overwhelming, undeniable force. Mac leaned against the dwarf. Raim, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, his eyes locked on the screen. "They moved fast," he noted, a deep sense of satisfaction rumbling in his chest. "Once we dumped that audio recording of the $5 million bribe to the federal prosecutor's encrypted portal last night, It stopped being a corporate dispute and instantly became a major criminal syndicate investigation. You cornered them perfectly, Mia. I watched as a swarm of federal agents marched through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, carrying stacks of empty cardboard boxes. They were there to seize the physical servers before Quinn Baker and her HR team could initiate a localized data wipe. But even as the raid unfolded on live television, the most terrifying validation of our work was coming from the Gulf of Mexico itself. Willow sat at the dining table, her laptop pinging with an urgent email notification. It was a forwarded preliminary report from the independent marine structural engineers the Coast Guard had dispatched to inspect the abandoned Oceanic Vanguard at first light. "Mom, you need to read this," Willow said, her voice dropping to a hushed, awestruck whisper. The engineers dropped a submersible drone down to the foundational risers. The deepwater trap miles set. It actually snapped. I walked over and read the scrolling text on her screen. My breath caught in my throat. The illegal hydraulic fracturing had weakened the seabed so severely that when the massive storm surge of Hurricane Cassandra hit, the ocean floor literally gave way beneath the rig's primary support pylons. If you hadn't triggered the emergency blowout preventers and initiated the failsafe lockdown, Mac said, reading over my shoulder, the sudden drop in the foundational structure would have sheared the active drill pipe right in half. The pressure from the unchecked well would have caused an immediate, catastrophic explosion. I closed my eyes, a cold shiver running down my spine despite the warm sunlight filtering through the window. Miles Green's arrogant, misogynistic dismissal wasn't just a brutal insult. It was a premeditated, desperate smokescreen. He had known the seabed was collapsing. He fired me and threw me on that chopper not just to blind the safety monitors, but to ensure I wasn't there to trigger the alarms when the well inevitably blew. He planned to blame the disaster on the hurricane, collect the multi-million-dollar insurance payout for the conglomerate, and bury the evidence of his illegal drilling under a mile of ocean water. He thought he was setting a trap for a massive payday, sacrificing 200 innocent lives to protect his wealthy lifestyle and his corporate masters. Instead, I had stolen the keys to his trap and locked him inside it. On the television screen, the camera zoomed in on the front entrance of the corporate building. 2 federal agents emerged, firmly escorting a man in a rumpled, custom-tailored suit. His hands were securely cuffed behind his back. It was Miles Green. His arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed terror of a man who suddenly realized his wealth and privilege could no longer protect him. "Look at him," Willow murmured, a fierce, righteous anger in her eyes. "He looks exactly like the coward he is." I didn't smile. I just watched him get shoved into the back of a dark SUV. The deepwater trap had finally sprung, and it had caught the very monsters who built it. But we weren't finished. The head of the snake was still trapped in his boardroom, and it was time to bring Luca Campbell down. 6 weeks later, the crisp, cool air of early November signaled a definitive change in the season, mirroring the monumental shift in the energy sector. I was sitting in the heavily paneled echoing chamber of a congressional oversight committee in Washington, D.C. The room was packed with journalists, industry regulators, and flashing cameras. I wore a sharp, tailored navy blue suit, feeling a profound sense of grounded strength that I had never felt while wearing grease-stained coveralls. Directly across the room, sitting at the witness table, was Luca Campbell. He looked as though he had aged 20 years in a single month. His silver hair was thin and unkempt, and the charcoal gray suit hung loosely on his suddenly frail frame. The multi-billion-dollar energy empire he had ruthlessly built on a foundation of illegal drilling and corporate intimidation was currently being dismantled piece by piece. The fallout had been absolute. The morning after the federal raid, the conglomerate stock was permanently halted and swiftly delisted from the major exchanges. The board of directors, terrified of personal liability, immediately ousted Luca and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection to shield their remaining assets from the tidal wave of federal fines and class action lawsuits. Mr. Campbell, the lead senator spoke into his microphone, his voice booming through the silent chamber. We have the certified telemetry logs. We have the internal memos bearing your exact digital signature. And most damning of all, we have the sworn testimony of your offshore installation manager, Miles Green, who accepted a federal plea deal yesterday afternoon. Luca visibly flinched at the mention of Miles's name. There is no loyalty among thieves, especially corporate ones. Facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for criminal negligence and environmental sabotage, Miles had eagerly turned state's evidence. He detailed every single illegal directive Luca had ever issued, completely shattering the CEO's defense that he was unaware of the rig's operational details. Furthermore, the senator continued, his gaze narrowing, we have the audio recording of you attempting to bribe a federal whistleblower, Ms. Mia Scott, with $5 million to bury this catastrophic cover-up. Do you have any final statement before this committee refers your case to the Department of Justice for immediate criminal indictment? Luca leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one last, desperate spin, one final corporate lie. But he looked across the room and met my eyes. I didn't look away. I held his gaze with the unwavering, cold certainty of a woman who had stood her ground in a Category 4 hurricane and refused to break. Luca Campbell closed his mouth, swallowed hard, and looked down at his hands. On the advice of my legal counsel, he mumbled, his voice a defeated, hollow rasp, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The chamber erupted in a frenzy of camera flashes and loud murmurs. It was over. The empire had officially sunk.